If, like me, you're learning to become a better miniature painter by watching YouTube videos, you'll probably find there's quite a disconnect between the pros doing it online and you attempting to replicate those techniques on your own hobby bench. And I've found that much of that reason is usually because it's very different when you go through it yourself versus the people who've been doing it for years, and half of the things they know but don't tell you, they've completely forgotten about because they're subconscious detail steps that just come to them naturally at this stage. Which is exactly why I decided to meet up with Byron and go through the things that I'd learned from his videos and let him show me directly what I hadn't picked up on, so that I can show you what you're probably missing too. So hi, I'm Ross, this is Fohammer Videos, and here's 10 tips for better dry brushing. So the idea behind this was simple. I turn up at Byron's house, I dry brush a model in any way I see fit, based on what I'd learned from his online videos. He then gives me a live demonstration, and I dry brush again with his advice as I'm doing it. And I need to point out here, we actually filmed this in between lockdowns back in August 2020, so sorry for the delay, Byron, but when I say I'm going to do a video, I'm going to do it. Here it is. Tip number 1 is use the largest brush you can get away with. And this isn't just true for dry brushing, it's also true for all miniature paint brushes. Most people, especially beginners, will always choose a smaller brush. I mean, at the end of the day, we're painting miniatures, so surely we want something small to get into all of those details. But actually, it's the exact opposite that's often true here. When I say the largest brush you can get away with, basically, whatever it is, you don't want the ferrule hitting the model, but if you can get away with using a bigger brush and still get to all the extremities of a model, definitely go with the bigger one. The payoff here is that you'll end up with a much smoother result. Tip 2 is position, posture, and support. So with the position of the model, you want to get it braced on something ideally. If you're holding it loose in one hand and you're jabbing a brush at it, you've not really got much control of smashing these two objects together. Ideally, if you can, brace the model on a hard surface. Brace your elbows on your desktop, and when it comes to posture, get a desk where you can sit lower than the desktop so that your arms aren't awkwardly stretched, giving you shoulder and lower backache. Tip 3 is clean your dry brush, and the way to do this is actually quite simple. I was doing it completely wrong. I would dry brush for a session, want to change colour, which means I've then got to wash the dry brush, soap the dry brush, clean the dry brush, and wait for it to dry. It turns out that cleaning a dry brush is much simpler. In fact, it's the same as dry brushing with a dry brush, and this is where a texture palette comes in handy, because you can just waft it back and forth across the surface and swirl it round until all the dry paint comes off the bristles. That's exactly what you should be doing. And the bonus tip here is to use the edge of a texture palette to dig in and get all of that crud off from the edges of your dry brush. What you want to do is make sure you're not getting those horrible thick tide marks, because these will eventually dry and ruin the brush. And speaking of the texture palette, that leads us on to tip 4. The texture palette is your best friend. A lot of people wonder what these are, and it's more than just a mat to protect your desktop from errant bits of paint. This is actually really great for not only loading your paint, but also getting it in and working it into your brush, but then also testing how much paint will come off before you apply it to a model. So make sure you're using the whole area of your texture palette and the textured parts of the area to see just how much and how well it's going to perform when you apply that to your miniatures. Tip 5 is something I never did, and that is to prepare your colours in advance. Not just the colour you're applying, but the next colour, and ideally the next colour after that. Many people, when they start out with this technique, and again myself included, will jump from one colour directly to the next. But by having these on your palette, what you can do is mix through the colours so that as you're building up a solid gradient on your model, you can actually do it more gradually by having a 50-50 mix between the two as a pre-shade before going directly on to a lighter colour. Tip 6 is to wet your dry brush. Okay, that sounds a little bit insane. You actually just want to dampen it. And this is where most people have the problem, or most people ask questions. This dampening pad seems very odd when it comes to dry brushing. So how exactly do you use it? How much water is enough, and how much is too much? Well, the key really is in understanding what the point of this water is. And it has two jobs here. One is to help the paint flow from the brush onto the model, but 2 is to also keep the brush protected from drying paint. So when it comes to the texture palette, what you want to do obviously is put a drop or two into your dampening pad, swirl it round with your finger, and then just introduce your brush tip to it so it becomes damp. And the key to getting it right is to understand what bad looks like. So as you know, if you put water on bristles, they'll start to clump together. So if you get this from your dampening pad, that's too much water. Just look at the end of your bristles, and if you see them clumping after you've applied some water to it, then you've put too much on. There's an easy fix here, just swish it around across a dry surface or your texture palette and get that water off and start again. When you apply the brush to the actual palette and then to the back of your hand, you should generally be able to feel that it's cool to the touch because of the water, but not see any of the water come off the brush onto your hand. Finding out that it's too dry will only really come into effect when it comes to applying it to a model. You'll find that the paint's coming off in quite a chalky way, and sometimes this is affected by the paint, but as you become more experienced, you can normally start to feel it where the brush begins to drag across the raised edges. If this happens, just try applying a bit more water from the dampening pad, swoosh it around the texture palette again until it's coming off smoothly. Tip 7 is to load paint from the side. As you've probably noticed, these dry brushes are all domed in shape, very different from the other brands that have got straight and flat-edged brushes. If you jab your brush straight into the paint, just like with the dampening pad, it's going to clump together in the middle, and that's the last thing you want. Steadily load it on from the side as you're swizzling the brush around, and you'll find that you get it evenly spread across the entire surface. That's exactly what you want to be doing when you're loading your brush with paint. Which leads perfectly on to tip 8, which is stipple, swipe, swoosh and smush. Don't forget the 4 S's because they're very important when it comes to applying paint to miniatures. Once again, because of the domed shape of these brushes, you can apply a lot more techniques than simply swiping it left and right. Stippling, for example, is the process of stabbing at the model until you get a general buildup of paint, and this is perfect for your base layers because not only does it help with coverage, but it also adds a very slight texture to the surface of models for your later layers to bite onto. Swiping is the simple process of going left to right, which most people use for everything, and this is great specifically for picking up the raised edges of a model. But don't forget to swoosh the brush round, that means twizzle it in your fingers in a circular motion as you're applying it, because this also helps with the domed edge to bring out much more of that surface detail and blend the colours together. And smushing is the process of taking paint that's already on a canvas, or in this case your miniature, and swirling it around to help it blend in. Now this is most commonly used in fine art with oil paints and general wetter, more like gel paints, but here we're trying to force it to happen with acrylics. This generally fits somewhere halfway between stippling and swooshing because you sort of push the brush towards the model and then twist it as you go. While remembering step 2, your position and posture, and making sure everything's supported, play around with these different techniques and move the brush around in all of its different directions, just so you can get an understanding of how it performs. If you don't want to do this on a model, you can do it on your texture pad and get an idea as well. Tip 9 is slow down to speed up. And what I mean by that is, with your earlier stages, I tended to rush through it and try and get paint on my model as fast as possible. But Byron went much slower on those earlier stages so that he could get the texture on there that he wanted and start giving it a surface that future paint can bite onto. So make sure with that first stippling layer you are going steady and getting the paint evenly distributed across the model so that it's not going into all the cracks and crevices and clogging up some of the recessed detail. And the final tip is paint matters. And what I mean by that is different paints react differently to different techniques. A lot of the time with dry brushing you can find that your results look very, very chalky just through the process of the technique and not following some of the tips that you've seen here. If your paint's too dry, it'll be chalkier. If it's too wet, it'll slide everywhere. You can be finding it harder by just using paints that don't work so well with these techniques. For example, I love pro-acryl paints, but when I use this with a dry brushing technique, they're even chalkier than most of the others that you would get from the likes of Citadel, Vallejo, the Army Painter, etc. As a general rule of thumb, you want to go for some softer sheen paints, and things like metallics especially that have that gel-like medium work incredibly well with dry brushing. Unfortunately though, a lot of this is trial and error, which why watching Artist Opus YouTube channel give you some great techniques and tips, because they show you what colours they use and have had success with, and they'll even tell you where they've struggled with certain paints too. Finally, as a bonus tip, keep painting. And the reason I say that is because once you've finished dry brushing, the model's not complete. You can go back in with a manual brush and accent the recesses or bring out the highlights further, add more colours to your model. Or as I did, because I'm quite lazy, just cover the entire thing in streaking grime, which helps everything pop out. So that's it guys, those were my 10 tips on how to dry brush better, specifically from sitting down with the pro and actually going through it. And I really hope this helps you bridge the gap from watching videos on YouTube to actually applying the expert level of results that you can see them put out. So a huge thank you to you for watching. If you did like it, please don't forget to hit like, comment, subscribe, notification bell, all that. A huge thanks to our patrons who you can see on screen now. Until I see you guys next time, Fohammer out.